Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of our 7 Investing podcast. I'm 7 Investing founder and CEO Simon Erickson. We've gotten used to, as investors, following companies through their quarterly conference calls, where companies are reporting important metrics like their revenue growth or their quarterly earnings per share. But things are a little bit different if you're a development stage drug producer, where it's actually much more interesting information is the progress of the clinical trials and the progress that you're making with drug candidates that you want to bring to market. And so it's very exciting that we have a big event coming up this next week. The JP Morgan Annual Healthcare Conference, simply known often as the JPM, is holding its 39th annual meeting. It's an all virtual event this year due to the coronavirus pandemic, but it is also one of the biggest events for the industry throughout the entire year. And I'm so happy to welcome our 7 Investing Lead Advisors, Maxx Chatsko and Manisha Samy, to help us follow this event, talk about some of the things that they're watching as they look at this space, and give some predictions of what we think we're going to have happen after JP Morgan this year. So Maxx and Manisha, welcome to the podcast this evening.
Hey, Simon. Hey, Manisha. How you guys doing?
Doing great, Maxx. Manisha, are you ready to get started?
Let's roll.
Maxx, let's start with the highest level question. What is JP Morgan? Why is this such a big deal?
Yeah, so JPM, let's start off when it is. It's next week. It's from Monday to Thursday, or through Thursday, I should say. So January 11th through January 14th. And, it's a meeting conference when, a lot of companies get to come and pitch themselves, tease major announcements that are coming up, whether it's new product or some new service, a lot of acquisitions, a lot of deal making. Usually, probably not too much of that. With it being a virtual event, right? There's not so much shaking hands, kissing babies anymore. Okay, no kissing babies at past JPMs. I made that up maybe. But, as an example, like in 2014, for instance, Illumina announced the $1,000 genome at JPM, right? So these are the types of announcements that everybody kind of is anticipating, right, of that magnitude. It's really the biggest event of its kind for the healthcare industry.
Okay, so that sounds pretty good. The 10,000-foot level. There's kissing of babies. There's some big announcements of stuff going on there. Manisha, this is an investing show. Why should investors care about the JPM?
Sure. So basically, the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference. So there's a main conference, and there's a number of other side conferences surrounding it. It's everything healthcare. So anyone who's even tangentially affiliated with healthcare, biotech, pharmaceuticals, med devices, they tune in. It's basically an annual thermometer for the health of the life sciences industry. It sets the tone for the rest of the year. It's especially important for, companies themselves. So companies both in the public sector and the private sector, a lot of times they strike deals during this conference because it's very rare for companies to be face-to-face all in one place. So it's real. There are a number of things that I look at here as an investor. One, what is the conference focused on? Usually it gives you an indicator of what's up and coming, what are people looking at, what are companies looking at, what are kind of new technologies that is in focus, what are people paying attention to. I personally like to look at the private side of things, comparing it to the public market. And are there private companies that are competitive to public companies that I own shares of, for example? What should I be looking out for? Or if the IPO, what are companies that I want to have, on the radar if it chooses to go public? So it's a fun time. It's basically drinking from a fire hose. And I think as an investor, there's a lot of information that is disseminated that people should definitely take note of. And it's also just fun. You get a lot of science. So
drinking from a fire hose is a good way to put it. There's like way too much information, and I think a lot of people are going to be overwhelmed, especially with it being digital, right? It's just everyone's going to have to rely on, press releases and virtual presentations and things. So it might be more ramped up this year, I think.
Yeah, actually, so usually at the JP Morgan conference, there are 5 presentation tracks. Because it's virtual, this year there's 9. So there are 9 different presentations going on at any given time. So
now, okay. Yeah, usually, so we just did like a podcast on ASH, which is maybe like the second biggest event of the year. It's only for hematology, of course. But is there that much clinical data getting reported at JPM? It's mostly not, it's not a scientific meeting, right? But are there companies still reporting clinical data?
Yeah, so There might be a few companies who decide to release clinical data. Usually it's business updates. So even if if there are companies that just had their quarterly earnings, for example, they might add, one or two things extra or announce a new product launch. So not necessarily scientific, but mostly just things that they're working on. They might divulge an extra, tidbit or two on kind of scientific things. But I think most of the companies, they're just talking about their product pipeline programs, and just answering questions that other companies might have or other investors might have.
Well, we're going to take I'll look at a couple of things that are really interesting to you all that are coming up from this conference next week. And by the way, Maxx and Manisha will be providing coverage on our @7 Investing Twitter handle throughout the week. Stay tuned to see the updates that they give as they learn more about what's taking place at this conference. But Maxx, let me start with you for the first topic that we'd like to talk about here today. Manisha said there's a lot of activity with both private and public companies. Let's focus on the public side of that, because the first thing that you actually want to talk about is valuations in healthcare right now. What's on your radar for this topic?
Yeah, so going into JPM, as most investors know, we're seeing some pretty healthy premiums, especially in biotech and drug development, right? Now, JPM, the conference, usually, we see these large increases, some volatility around this week's conference. So I'm interested to see and watch what goes on this year, right? We already have this increased volatility in the markets just at like a baseline level. So what happens when there's other announcements or partnerships or acquisitions? I mean, things could get pretty crazy this year, right? I don't have any crazy predictions or anything like that, but I think, investors might want to hold on to their hats. So I guess, the takeaway here for me, this is how I'm approaching it. Even in a bull market when there isn't what's going on now, we still always have to guard against hype. You have to be able to, tease out the signal from the noise. So, every year there's always companies that, let's say they abuse the power of the press release, right? They announce things that maybe it's more fluff and marketing and it's not really anything. And their stock price might still jump on it. This year, I think we might see investors attach healthy premiums to, legitimate news. And you have to be careful not to like overpay too much for something, even if it's a good product or has a lot of growth opportunity. Just you have to be able to tease out what's hype and what's not, I guess, is my takeaway there for investors who are trying to, ride the volatility, I guess.
Sure. And this is, Manisha, I'll hand this to you as well, because this is a topic we've talked about before, is the inefficiency of this segment of the market, right? There's data points, but it's different than following the same store sales at Starbucks when you're looking at trying to clinical data and make sense of new technologies out there. I mean, do you have thoughts on private or public valuations of the companies in this space right now?
Yeah, traditionally, I feel like early stage companies, they're riskier, but because of advances that we've seen in technology, and before I go on, early stage companies are always risky. Science we haven't validated everything, but I do think because of recent technological advances, we can say that the risk level is compressing a bit, and we, as investors and people evaluating or valuing these companies, we haven't necessarily stayed abreast of those technological changes in our personal analysis. So I think a lot of earlier stage pipeline programs are still underappreciated. Maybe not in 2020. It's been very healthy for biotech, but even then, I think we focus so much on phase 3 trials because it's about to commercialize. So it'll be cash flow. It's a commercial drug, so we actually have revenue. So these are revenue generating companies potentially. But if you look at preclinical stage or preclinical stage companies, so whether and products that are in preclinical stages, or even phase 1, phase 2, I think a lot of these companies are still undervalued because we're not valuing their products properly. So we think the likelihood of failure is higher than potentially being approved. So generally speaking, I like looking at early stage companies, and not only that, but smaller biotech companies. I feel like oftentimes these are founder led. The innovators of technologies are still part of the company or at some capacity part of the board of directors. And especially now, I think, in terms of technology and, working with other technologies that are up and coming, they know how it integrates within their platform. So basically, I'm looking at it from a technology point of view and understanding that. So basically, I think smaller biotech companies undervalued. If I look at the private sector, I used to believe that it was overvalued, but now I think that is changing a bit as we see more and more private companies emerge.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, there's some healthy premiums, obviously, and there is some wild speculation. But just today, I was reading about two different things. Like there's something called biomolecular condensate, which are coming out. There's a lot of startups building pipelines around those. There's gamma delta T cells. There's a bunch of different startups working on developing those. So there's so much innovation, and there's so much niche innovation, almost like people going real deep into specific topics, specific technical platforms, and it's hard for the market to keep up. So I think that also drives some of the inefficient pricing we see with some of these earlier stage companies.
Yeah, and Max, we'll definitely be keeping an eye out for that volatility. I think that you do a great job, and like I think you were hinting at with the comments on this, of separating the signal from the noise. What's an interesting real development versus just what's hype out there surrounding a big conference like this?
Yeah, and actually one example, we just talked about it, was the $1,000 genome, right? So that was announced in 2014 at the JPM. And, that was really kind of technically still hype. Even today, we don't have a $1,000 genome. I think the real cost you get are closer to maybe $4,000 per human genome for good coverage and everything like that. So we still don't have it. So even that was hype. It's, 7 years later.
Fair enough. Now, Manisha, let's bring the second topic to you, because I think this is related to, we're talking about valuations of public and private companies. We've seen a lot of IPO activity and also M&A activity. What do you make of all this in the healthcare space right now?
I think we're seeing a lot of technological change, and what Max was saying earlier, a lot of companies are emerging on very kind of niche areas, diving deep in, gamma delta T cells. And I think it's because we're able to accelerate the pace of research. That's why we have all these companies emerging. A lot of pharmaceutical companies, they're reaching patent cliffs. So they're looking out to acquire growth stories. So that means acquiring smaller biotech companies. In 2019, even before day one of the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference, Eli Lilly bought Loxo for $8 billion. And that basically indicated that they wanted to expand their cancer franchise. It's a huge market. And then we saw later on kind of throughout the week that there were more acquisitions based on broadening their cancer portfolio. So, in terms of new IPOs expected, or IPOs or even mergers and acquisitions in 2021, I'm expecting, a fair amount. Maybe it's not within that week of the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference, but it might be a few weeks later, February, March, but in Q1, I do expect there to be quite a few. I believe there were 12 mergers and acquisition announcements in 2020. At the very least, I'm sure we'll see an equal number in 2021. I'm really excited to see what happens during JP Morgan. Usually that's kind of the most exciting part of the conference.
Tell me a little bit about SPACs. You have some statistics here that there's been quite a few healthcare-related SPACs this past year.
Yes. So in 2020, there were 33 SPACs, or healthcare-focused SPACs that were announced. So of those 33, 5 of them found their significant other. So they're private companies that they're merged with. So they're, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you know a bit more about SPACs than I do here, Simon. But I think they have 2.5 years or so to find a potential target to merge with. So I think in 2021, the focus will be on the private sector. The SPACs that have not found a private company to merge with, they will be kind of sifting through and listening to pitches of private companies and finding targets that they can merge with. So I think, for the first, I think most of JP Morgan will be focused on the private side, finding new technologies, new up and coming, whether it's on the cancer side, whether it's on the diagnostic side, or whether it's focusing on autoimmune diseases or rare diseases. So that's going to be really interesting. I believe, SPACs, in 2020, SPACs raised $6.3 billion. So that's, a fair amount. I'd hope that, we'll see a few SPAC-based announcements during JP Morgan week, maybe, a handful, but this is definitely the time to be vetting private companies.
Yeah, and for anyone who's listening to this podcast or wondering what the heck we're talking about, a SPAC is a special purpose acquisition company where funds can be raised up front, and then that company, which is a financial shell company, can merge with an existing operating private company to bring both of them public at the same time. It's much more efficient than the traditional initial public offering IPOs that we've gotten used to. And so, Manisha, if I hear you correctly, you're saying it's going to be really interesting to see which of those private companies with some real innovative science are actually on display, because there might be a new way that they can start raising money these days.
Right. And also, one of the things I was thinking about is, we have SPACs. So for these private companies, they have, a ton of options now. Do they want to be acquired by a company? Do they want to IPO, or do they want to be a target for a SPAC? So I think they have pricing power. So whichever methodology gives them, the best cash value, I think, the cards are in their hands. So I think private companies are, they're winners right now for all intents and purposes. And I'm keeping my eye out in terms of, which private companies that I see are interesting and may have leverage, whether it's an IPO or they are part of a SPAC deal.
It will certainly be interesting to watch, especially if we get some of these large deal makers. We've seen Chamath Palihapitiya kind of, doing some frontier technology stuff that he's raising a lot of money through his SPACs. Be interesting to see if we see some other personalities like that on the healthcare side of things as well. Max, any thoughts before we move on IPOs or SPACs?
Yeah, the way to maybe think about it is, when a company does a typical IPO, they do a road show. They go and drum up interest and try to make it easier for those investment bankers to sell the blocks of shares they're buying at the IPO. So JPM, or these big conferences, are kind of like a free road show, right? You get to go and you get good publicity. It's amplified on, across media because there's a lot of coverage of this event. So it's a good way for private companies, even some that might be in stealth mode, to kind of emerge and come out and, showcase what their technology platform is, what their pipeline might be. And as Manisha said, whether that's an acquisition, there's a lot of larger companies that are starving for assets or need to acquire growth. Maybe their early stage pipelines aren't that impressive, or they're kind of pigeonholed in some of these, I don't want older maybe focus areas. I don't want to say that, but we saw like Eli Lilly's trying to get into a lot more gene therapy. Bayer's still investing heavily in cell therapies right now. We just saw Biogen make a deal for, building out its ophthalmology pipeline. So like these types of things. I mean, there's going to be a lot of activity, a lot of interesting things coming out next week.
It will be interesting to see how a more efficient way of fundraising for those trials could put public companies much more on display. Max, the next topic you wanted to talk about was actually next generation diagnostics. What is on your radar with this topic?
So this has been a really hot space in recent years. When it started off, I don't know, a decade ago or whatever, I always thought this was kind of hype, right? Like, oh, we're never going to be able to, find signals with biomarkers and detect cancer early. That's ridiculous. But yeah, we actually can, obviously, right? We have these big companies, Guardant Health now, Exact Sciences, Illumina is trying to acquire Grail. Did that close? Do you guys know the acquisition? Well, Exact Sciences just closed its acquisition of Thrive Early Detection, or just Thrive, just this week. So there's so much activity here, so much money to be made. Obviously, these are brand new markets. There's multi-billion-dollar markets. It's just wide open for opportunity and capturing big market share. So we were talking about this internally. I mean, we stumble across a new liquid biopsy platform or company like every month, it seems, right? We're always like, wait, did you ever hear of this? No, what's going on? So I'm interested to see how what's going on at with JPM, what presentations they make, any announcements. We were talking about, again, there's so many companies. Eventually, there's going to be consolidation. Guardant Health ended September with over $1 billion in cash. Exact Sciences just made a big acquisition, but it also ended September with 1.3 billion in cash. So there's a lot of smaller companies to be gobbled up. I think we've kind of seen that already in genetic testing, right? There's like a couple companies emerging as like the big companies. They're consolidating the field. They're buying up these tinier little companies to add to their technology stacks. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that in liquid biopsies, or I would include other next generation diagnostics that in that, not just looking for cancer, but early detection of various other diseases.
Sure. And Max, so getting to the science of this, and Manisha, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, but kind of the fundamental science is we're trying to detect things earlier and earlier stage, right? You mentioned Grail, you mentioned Guardant Health. I mean, the ultimate goal of diagnostics is to be the least invasive as possible, so you have good patient outcomes. You don't have to pull out the scalpel if you can use a blood test for something like that, but also to detect and characterize correctly cancerous tumors through the bloodstream or through other ways. I mean, is it a lot of proprietary IP that goes into each one of these diagnostics? And do you think that's what makes this area ripe for consolidation?
Yeah, so I guess there's two ways to look at it. First is there's a lot of context and nuance that goes into each product approval for a liquid biopsy. So, there might be half a dozen products that are targeting, non-small cell lung cancer. But you have to dig a little bit beyond that, right? It's not just about the indication. These products might be approved for specific mutations and specific genes. It might be for only patients that are eligible for certain treatments. It might be only using next generation sequencing, which I think everybody does now anyway. So it's not just looking at what cancer are they looking for. It's also all these other conditions that get slapped on the approval and the specifics of each approval. So that's the first thing. It's not as crowded as it looks. There's a lot of different ways to slice it up. Second is, the longer term, the holy grail is like, how early can we detect cancer, right? Right now we're detecting, more advanced cancers, which is still very valuable, and using it for, detecting recurrence. If people have had remission. So that's very valuable as well. But the earlier we can detect cancer, the easier it is to treat, the better the prognosis for the patient. But that's also a much harder data problem, right? So I found this little example here. So most of these platforms look for something called cell-free DNA, also called circulating tumor DNA. So it's abbreviated with cfDNA or ctDNA. I've seen both. It means the same thing, I think. So for, we have prenatal diagnostics, right? And the cell-free DNA of, the baby in the mother's blood is about 10%. So that's a very high percentage. And that's why we've seen these products, they've been around for, 10 years. Remember that company Sequenom a while ago? That's when I started investing when I was a baby, right? So 10% of the composition of maternal blood, that's a pretty high percentage. For advanced cancers, though, that cell-free DNA composition drops all the way to 0.46% of what's found in the blood. So there's a lot more noise, to use that analogy again, very small signal of what you're actually trying to find. So you need very good detection tools, and you need very good computational power to be able to detect that signal. But then when you get to early cancers, the cell-free DNA composition in the blood drops all the way to 0.01%. So it's an incredibly difficult data problem to solve. You need a lot of data. You need a lot of computational power. We probably need better reagents and assays and proteins and enzymes that we don't even have yet. So all these companies are, trying to race ahead and get there, and who can have the first one or who can have the best data. So we see Guardant Health has its own proprietary platform for early detection of cancers. Grail, obviously, that's what the whole platform is built around, as far as I know. Exact Sciences, that's why it acquired Thrive. Thrive has, in my opinion, what might be one of the best so far platforms for early detection, liquid biopsies. But the caveat, of course, is most of these are in studies that won't be releasing data until, the second half of this decade, or, the end of this decade. So it's going to be a while before, these products emerge. But, man, what it means for healthcare and the prognosis of cancers, I mean, how do you put a value on that, right? Right now, it's kind of hard to see, but it's going to come down to the data. who can detect it, at what stage, what percentage specificity and selectivity do you have? So, that's how this competitive landscape is going to kind of get sorted.
Yeah, I predict not the winner, because I think there's definitely enough room for multiple companies or liquid biopsy companies to have great technology. But the tricky part would be timing when to get the actual liquid biopsy. So with cfDNA, basically these are fragments of nucleic acids after a cell undergoes apoptosis or necrosis. So it's only in the bloodstream for a certain period of time. And for specific types of cancers, the duration of how long it's in the bloodstream is different. So if you wait too long, so say, maybe you waited 2 days too long before you got your liquid biopsy, it won't show it. It won't show up as positive, or even if you are positive. So you have to time it right. So I think computation is going to be extremely important. Understanding the disease, and it's going to be very different for which type of tumor as well, which Max was saying. So it's going to be very specific to that. So I think a platform that is modular and scalable for multiple type, or that basically can predict based on the type of tumor and the kinetics of that tumor will be helpful. And then recurrence monitoring is also going to be a huge market. A lot of these companies will be able to positively or negatively confirm the presence of a tumor, but then can they adequately do recurrence monitoring for these cancers? I think that's going to be an important part as well. So I think plenty of room for winners. And then you can tell that this is a huge market. Invitae had acquired Archer Diagnostics for $1.4 billion. And just shortly after, that's when Illumina decided to rail Grail back into and acquired them at a premium, for that matter. So a huge area, there in terms of therapeutics, definitely a huge market, but detecting early stage cancer, as Max said, that's the holy grail that we're trying to achieve here.
And that's a good point from Manisha about, the timing of when you perform a liquid biopsy. So a lot of these companies are building technologies. So, cell-free DNA is kind of like what they're focused on, but then there's all these ancillary and like things around it that they're trying to find as well. So companies are building technology around additional biomarkers because you might need to look for specific proteins or, other types of DNA, or not just that you can detect the cell-free DNA, but also, how is it methylated, right? You want to look at the epigenetics of it. So there's all these other really super nerdy things Manisha and I could talk about forever. Maybe we should probably talk about that when we get some the article system up on our website. But go into the nuance and context of it. But there's all these other areas, so it gets very complex very quickly. And I think that's where these tech platforms will be differentiated, as well as Manisha said, a modular, scalable one as well.
Yeah, I agree. And just to pitch in with my 2 cents too, it's really encouraging to see a lot of the payers getting on board with this. You're starting to see some local coverage determinations for Medicare. There's codes now that you can actually get a liquid biopsy reimbursed. It's not just out of pocket for patients, for the doctors. There's things like that. A lot of that overhead, just kind of stuff like that we take for granted. When you're a really technical company, you don't want to have to deal with a lot of that stuff, like dealing with the payers and Medicare and stuff like that. So I think it makes a case also for consolidation in this space as well. Manisha, let's change topics a little bit. Let's talk about AI in healthcare. Something else you wanted to talk about that you're watching for JP Morgan.
Yeah, so I was looking through different panels they had on AI, and then also the side conferences. There's a huge focus on AI and healthcare. So I'm excited to see what advancements we made. Max was the first to note this when AlphaGo, for DeepMind's AlphaGo, for protein folding, that was a huge feat for biotech and healthcare. Seeing what else is up and coming. So there's AWS and Illumina. There's a panel just on that, seeing how so cloud services and how I guess AI there. There's a different panel, or I guess an event called 4D Meets AI. So they're talking about advancing drugs, devices, diagnostics, and digital health using AI. I think we will be seeing more and more tech companies collaborating with biopharmaceutical companies. So I'd like to see which biotech and biopharmaceutical companies are looking towards collaborating with traditional technology companies. In 2020, we saw that Twist Biosciences, for example, decided to collaborate with not only just Illumina, which is a device or a tools and diagnostics company, but Microsoft. So we have Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, they're all entering into the health arena. I think it will be interesting to see which biotech companies decide to go, the tech route. And I think AI is going to become a very important pillar in accelerating and advancing biotech innovation. So that's part of the reason I'll be paying attention to that. I think those that choose to go towards the AI route will be long-term winners, especially, as for example, when we're talking about liquid biopsies, you need that computational rigor. These technology companies have that capability. So it's not just biotech. We can't just have traditional biologists, but we need engineers, computer scientists to create these algorithms, predict certain candidates. We want to increase productivity in R&D. So I think those biotech companies that are talking about AI and collaborating with technology companies, they're forward looking. And I think as an investor, that's an important metric for me to look at, because I think those would be the long-term winners. So not, companies that are just still working on or looking towards, I will be using a pipette and doing everything kind of the biological route. I think there's a convergence that's happening, and that's where innovation is.
Let's follow up on that one more step, Manisha, because we saw IBM Watson try to get into AI into healthcare a couple of years ago. Didn't work. Pushback from doctors, or at least a lot of doctors weren't very happy with the solution that it was coming up with. But now you see platforms like Google trying to get a lot of clinical data from hospitals, from Ascension Health out in the Midwest United States. I mean, do you think it's the right time for AI in healthcare right now? This has traditionally been a pretty slow-moving industry that's kind of shied away from tech companies creeping into their turf. But are things a little different now? Are we going to start seeing a lot more announcements?
I'd like to think so. I've worked with IBM Watson in terms of doing, so this was at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and in differential diagnosis, there were a few times where IBM Watson, they completely predicted, giving the wrong treatment, and the patient probably would have died if they listened to IBM Watson. But AI, the improvements we're seeing in AI, it's exponential. So I think we are kind of at the prime point where we can actually trust AI. So if you look at CRISPR, for example, so using CRISPR genome editing, so AWS actually has a free tool for researchers that they can use to basically predict, okay, here are guide sequences that you can use that will make sure that you don't have off-target genome editing. And that's helping researchers expedite their research process. So if you're looking at Google or any of these other tech companies, I think right now is the time, because we are seeing more accuracy. I don't remember the statistic, maybe Max, you remember, but what was the accuracy rate for AlphaGo in predicting predicting protein structure? It was something.
Oh, I don't remember. It just blew away all the other teams that were there, and it wasn't even close. So, but yeah, so I mean, I would agree, but I would say maybe I'd be a little more careful still with AI in bio. So the thing to remember is, it's not just about having data, it's about having annotated data. And biology is very complex. We still don't have a great handle on it. We still have a lot that we haven't standardized. So I think, like you said, using AI can go off the rails pretty quickly if we get to too full of ourselves with, the computer will figure it out. It'll give us the answer. It doesn't always work out like that right now. So there's specific areas where I think it makes a lot of sense. We can feed it a lot of pictures of suspicious looking moles and were they actually melanoma or not. And we can train a computer to do that better than a dermatologist and save everybody time and money. So that makes sense. It took DeepMind years and a lot of data and iterations to be able to, get the results it did last year. at that conference for protein folding. But when it started off, it wasn't necessarily that good. So it takes time to build out these data sets and tweak these things. Still an amazing advancement, but there's other areas where maybe it doesn't make sense right now, or maybe it won't ever make sense. I don't know. But like in drug discovery, right? We would need a lot more data early on. So, but yeah, I didn't know there was this at JPM. I didn't look at the I didn't look at the side conferences going on.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like AI is going to be a tool that seems like it's really innovative right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see so many companies just kind of all across the board using that within just a couple of years here. And so to close this out, I'm going to put both Manisha and Max on the spot, but I'll give them a little bit of time to think about this, and I'll answer it first to ask, what is one thing in healthcare that you personally are really excited about in 2021? And I might go first just by saying that I think that something I'm pretty excited about is seeing the shift from just the clinic and just the hospitals to kind of consumers getting more options of being more involved with their own health. We've seen companies like GoodRx going public, which allows people to choose from pharmacies more efficiently. We've seen telemedicine and teledoc kind of bringing people to computer screens to more regularly be checking in now with their acquisition of Livongo, actually getting data that empowers them to kind of be a little bit more involved. I like this push to consumer-facing healthcare that a lot of companies tend to be pursuing. Max, I'm going to go to you first. What's something you're really excited about in healthcare in 2021?
I'm going to stick with what I said earlier. I mean, I was just reading all day about this, so it's on my mind. But just how many startups are out there, and they're picking specific, niche areas. It's not just, maybe 5 years ago, a company would have said, oh, we're a gene therapy company. Well, now there's, you're not just a gene therapy company. You might be, well, we're a gene therapy company, but we've engineered this new vector that can hold more DNA, so we can actually, insert larger transgenes. Or we can target different tissues other than the liver or muscle. So there's like very specific pipeline and technology platforms that are getting built out. Or again, I was reading about biomolecular condensates. I didn't even know what those were until today. So, and there's a whole gang of startups investing in that, and a bunch of big money from big pharma or larger pharmaceutical companies, I should say, investing in those and helping them with their, Series A and B rounds. So just the emergence of all these areas, it's exciting. And to use the quote from Manisha, it's like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much to keep up with, but I'm looking forward to it.
Lots going on. How about it, Manisha? What's something you're really excited about in 2021 in healthcare?
There's so much I'm excited about. First of all, I would say I am so excited to get more human data for CRISPR-based clinical trials. I mean, I'm not saying, these are one-time cures, but the fact that they're one-time treatment paradigms, I would love to see it work, or, maybe it won't work, but I'm excited to see the data. I have high hopes for them. So I definitely am excited about that. I'm also excited about DNA-based storage improvements throughout 2021, seeing what happens there. And I'm also excited about advancing microbiome-based therapeutics. At one point people talked about it quite a bit. It kind of fell off the radar. So I hope that 2021 re-engages that field a bit more. So by microbiome-based research, basically, we're more bacteria than human. So, how these bacterial cells that are in us, how that affects our health, and using kind of our gut microbiome to change our kind of health status. So I think that's a very interesting concept. So I want to see that field advance a bit, and I'm excited because I think we will be seeing more clinical trial data there and more companies emerging in that field.
Well, no shortage of exciting things going on in healthcare right now. Our team is ready to drink from the fire hose and see what happens at the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference next year. Follow our coverage of the event. We're at 7 Investing on Twitter. Manisha's Twitter is at @msamy_7. That's MSAMY_7. And Max is at 7 Maxx Chatsko. That's at the number 7 MAXXCHATSKO. We are really excited about all the things going on. We can't wait to give some more updates on what happens at the conference next week. Max and Manisha, thanks very much for being on this episode of our 7 Investing podcast. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We are here to empower you to invest in your future. We are 7 Investing.